Hi people, today I'm going to be replacing a leaking oil cooler in this particular car. Now you'll know when the oil cooler is leaking because you'll start to see oil accumulating on the top of your coolant reservoir. You can see in here that there's oil floating on top of the coolant. That's made an absolute mess in the bottle. Now this oil cooler sits in between the exhaust manifold and the engine block, and it's quite tricky to get to, but I'll show you how. Now to kick things off here, you want to disconnect the coolant hoses to the coolant reservoir. I have a catch pan underneath here catching all this coolant as it drips out. Remove the two bolts here that secure the coolant reservoir on and get that out of the way. To make life a little bit easier, I'm going to remove the O2 sensor. It's just a matter of unplugging it from the harness and undoing the O2 sensor from the manifold. Once the tension's been taken off the O2 sensor here, it's quite easy just to wind out by hand. With the O2 sensor out of the way, it's time to remove the small bracket that held the O2 sensor wiring, and I'm also going to remove the bracket that holds the dipstick in place. This is going to give me some room to be able to remove the heat shield off the exhaust manifold. Once the bracket securing the dipstick tube is removed, just push it to the side for now. We'll need to deal with it from underneath before we pull it out. Now hopping underneath the vehicle, you can see that there are two bolts that secure the exhaust manifold and catalytic converter to the engine block. With these two bolts removed, you can now remove the three nuts that secure the exhaust flange to the bottom of the catalytic converter. With the exhaust nuts removed, you'll be able to pull off the flange. Just be careful not to damage this gasket here, as often this gasket can be reused. While I'm underneath the car here, I also like to remove the sump plug so that I can drain the oil, and this is just so that I don't spill any oil when I remove the dipstick tube. Now, working again from inside the engine bay, there are two small bolts that need to be removed that secure the lower part of the heat shield onto the exhaust manifold. I used a ring spanner here to fit over the Torx heads of these bolts, as they're quite difficult to get to, but with the ring spanner it made it quite possible. Now before we can remove this heat shield, I just want to get this dipstick tube out of the way. So just give it a little bit of a rotation and then it lifts straight up out of its location within the sump. Note there that there's an O-ring that helps with sealing. Now the heat shield is free to be removed from the exhaust manifold. However, there's not much room to do this and it will create a little bit of a headache for you, but persevere with it. It does slide up and out of the way. You may just have to bend a couple of the corners of the heat shield. It is a soft metal and can just be bent back into shape again, but it can just be lifted up and free of the engine. Now with the heat shield removed, it's quite easy to see the nuts that secure the exhaust manifold and catalytic converter assembly together. The lower half of these nuts can be removed through the access holes that are positioned in the exhaust manifold, while the ones along the top are quite easy to grab out. Now just to give ourselves a little bit more room here, I'm also taking off this lifting bracket from the engine, just so I've got a bit more space when I try and lift out this exhaust manifold. Now grabbing the exhaust manifold, you do need just to give it a bit of a wiggle to try and find its way up and out. It will try and catch up on things, but it can just be removed by lifting it straight up. You can see here that we've wiggled it out and it lifts up clear of the engine. Now with the exhaust manifold out of the way, it's our first chance to actually see our oil cooler. It's bolted directly to the block and it has metal coolant hoses attached to it as well. Now to begin removing this oil cooler, I'm just removing this top radiator hose here just to give myself a little bit more room. And I'm wanting to remove the metal coolant pipes that run into the oil cooler. There are two bolts that secure this end of the coolant hose to the thermostat housing. Once those two bolts are undone, that top pipe then is free to be moved. It's just fitted into the oil cooler with an O-ring on that left hand side and it can just be wiggled out. I still have a large catch pan underneath the engine just to catch all this coolant as it dribbles on out. Now moving on to the two bolts that secure the left hand coolant hose, and these bolts actually bolt into the back of the water pump assembly. Once these bolts are undone, you can't actually remove that pipe until the oil cooler itself is removed. There are a number of bolts that secure the oil cooler to the engine block. Once all these bolts were removed, I found that I needed to pry the oil cooler just free from the engine block before I could remove it. Once the oil cooler had been pried away from the block, it's simply a matter of just lifting it out. You can see that that left-hand coolant hose has come out with the oil cooler, and there's still one more small coolant hose that's left, and it's just held into the block with O-rings. Now before we install the new oil cooler, I want to make sure that the O-rings have all been replaced and are well lubricated. Here I'm just positioning the two pipes that sit on the left-hand side of the oil cooler into their approximate positions, getting ready to slide back onto the engine block. Now as you position the oil cooler up against the block, you need to pay particular attention to the two coolant hoses on the left hand side, making sure that they get into the correct location without damaging those O-rings. Now I forgot to video here me cleaning up the block surface before I put this new oil cooler on. Make sure that the block is free from any dirt or any of the old gaskets from the old oil cooler before you start to put it into position. Once you've got it into location, you can then do the two bolts that secure the left-hand coolant hose into the back of the water pump. Once they're done up, you can then tighten up the oil cooler to the block. Once the oil cooler has been fully tightened down to the block, it's time to install that right-hand coolant hose. Again, make sure the O-rings are lubricated. It slides into the oil cooler and then it bolts into the thermostat housing with those two bolts. Now that the oil cooler has been attached, I'll just quickly go through the reassembly process. Make sure that your exhaust manifold gasket is in place and in good condition. The exhaust manifold and catalytic converter assembly can be slid back down into place, and then it can be located onto the studs, ready to be attached back to the cylinder head. A little tip here to reinstall those lower bolts that secure the manifold on. Just put a little bit of masking tape on the nut. Then when you go to sit it into your socket, it will stay there and not fall out. It's much easier to reach in and get that nut started. Once all the nuts for the exhaust manifold have been attached, you can then grab your heat shield and position it into place. Again, this will take a little bit of time to slide it into place, and you may have to bend the heat shield a little bit, but it can just be bent back to its shape as it's only a soft steel. Now underneath the vehicle, make sure the exhaust gasket is in position. You can tighten up the three nuts that secure the exhaust pipe on to the manifold, and also the two bolts that secure the catalytic converter assembly to the bracket on the block. Now grab the dipstick tube, make sure that O-ring is in good condition, and from underneath the car, feed it up towards the top of the engine, making sure that it doesn't get caught up and hung up on things, and put the lower end of the dipstick tube in its location. From the top, give the dipstick tube a few taps with a mallet just to make sure it's fully in its location, and that the mounting bolt can be tightened up, and this also secures on the heat shield. It's a good time now to do the lower bolts for the heat shield as well. Now the O2 sensor can be reinstalled, and make sure you clip this wiring up into its little bracket and plug back into the wiring harness. Now reattach the coolant hose and the reservoir bottle, making sure everything is tightened up correctly. Now don't forget to top up your oil. Now as a bonus, my oil cooler came with a new oil filter, so I was quite pleased with that and didn't need to replace mine. Now initially I just topped this up with water as I wanted to flush the system a number of times before putting coolant in there. Also make sure that the heater is working and that the system is fully bled and topped up, and check for leaks as you go. So to finish off, I would suggest giving the engine a good clean down, as there would have been a fair bit of spilt oil and you don't want to leave that there. Hey, now thanks for watching. Any questions, make sure you put it in the comment section below. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Thanks for watching.